Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
I said, Georgia, Georgia, a song of you comes as sweet and clear as moonlight through the pine. Lacy and the Moonlight, the third part of the trilogy, by Bear Lair, 64. I was never too fond of hunting, so I sang inside my head. I had no moral obligation to the hunt. It just wasn't my thing. It involved getting up early, going out into the cold, and stumbling into the woods that I couldn't see to enjoy, then sitting and waiting or wandering along specific paths. Lots of trouble for some version when I didn't care for the taste that much. Deer has become scarce around my place since Lacy has been transformed. They used to wander right up into the yard. Now they were all but gone. I can't say that I blame them. I chuckled internally as those thoughts replaced the old Ray Charles tune. However, I wanted to do something fun with Lacy. She had been visiting the house, and I thought it would be good to spend time with her in her world. If I stayed at it, I'd end up being the world's foremost expert on Dogman. Not that I could tell anybody. They'd say I was a, wait for it, lunatic. Another internal chuckle. I was in an ebullient mood, despite where I was and what I was doing. It must have been the company. Just in time for dawn, the lead doe stepped into range to scout for the rest. She walked by cautiously, but I was downwind in a tree stand, so no problem. I waited for the next potential. There he was, a young buck, nice and tender, and legal. As soon as I fired and the unfortunate animal jumped in pain and startled, I heard the rush from behind me. A heavy carnivore poured past the base of the tree, and before the prey could jump, run, or fall, there was a splash of blood. A tumbling blur of fur, claws, hooves, and antlers that rolled over the forest floor and ended up with a decidedly deceased cervidae lying still on the loam, with Lacy crouched over the fresh-made corpse in a defensive posture, protecting our kill. The rest of the herd had long since scattered and fled for their lives. My little girl rose and howled in triumph and warning, "This is my kill. If you think you can, come and take it. Otherwise, wait your turn." Once I saw that look leave her eyes and the glowing turned back to mere reddish, I dared to speak. "You know, I could just as well be the one who howls. It was standing there dying when you finally showed yourself." Lacy gave me a dubious look that communicated, "Yeah, right." I slung my piece and began to carefully clamber down the ladder. The old pains had faded but not vanished. Only so much a body could do with bone on bone in the knees and lumbar discs out of place. I thought Lacy could hear the creaks and groans and pops in my joints. It hadn't stopped her from ripping open the belly of the deer to get at the lovely, wet, warm innards. I didn't watch. I could handle the sight and even the sounds and smells of her method of eating, but I didn't want to stare. It felt voyeuristic in some way. She didn't enjoy the smell of my cooked food either. Only fair. "You gonna save me a little backstrap?" I asked. sounding more hopeful than I felt, though that was the best part of the critter to my mind. Edible, even tasty if prepared properly. She looked up briefly, muzzle covered in gore and goblets of flesh. Ha! Face! Then she smiled and nodded. Of course, Dad. She didn't actually say that, but we'd begun to understand one another's language. Eerie, but what should I expect from my pet monster? Or was that monster pet? I cut off my portion of the kill, as any good alpha would, and took it back to the house. I told her I'd be back shortly, and I was. By then she'd eaten what she'd wanted and hidden the rest. We were both a little logy, with her with a fresh meal and me with lack of sleep. It was frosty that morning, but there hadn't been a hard freeze. We found a little clearing with some sunlight and soft grass, and stretched out to nap. I felt like a true wild man and his dog, on the hunt, now resting and enjoying the aftermath. Come and meet the latest member of our team, Tom Knox called to me from the open window of his patrol SUV, complete with its new canine logos. He stepped out and then called to a figure that had been partially concealed by the tinted windows of the vehicle. A shadowy mass with hints of fuzz soon became an energetic blur of bronze-colored fur that came quickly to heel. Earl Brooks, meet Oscar, K9. Oscar, a Belgian Malinois, looked up at me eagerly, a mix of friendliness and reserve on his features. He interrupted my panting for a quick closed-mouth gesture of professional greeting. I was getting good at reading doganese. I gave him a closed mouth, no teeth showing smile. Good morning, Oscar. Welcome to the force, and welcome to our town. I think you'll like Tom. He's a brave and true deputy, and we've faced tremendous terrors together. Oscar cocked his head for a moment to listen, and then gave a more friendly doggy grin. So, Sheriff Cloud wasn't just kidding when he spoke about a canine unit. Scoundrel never told me. Knox grinned in turn. Yes, sir, he wanted to surprise you. And Lacy. Not sure she'd like Oscar, and based on the way other dogs and hounds behave around her species, I think the feeling would be mutual. Never know, though. They are related. At least they were. I don't know. It gets confusing. I agreed with the young man, and we chatted for a while. He put Oscar back in the SUV. The working dog paused, clearly alerted to something in the line of trees. He huffed and growled a little, legs stiff, and the hair along his back and neck roughed out to make him appear larger and to deny a grip to the fangs of another predator. He dipped his head and whined just a little bit, then turned and leapt into his transport. Knox just shook his head, then looked at me questioningly. I don't think so. I haven't seen her for a couple days. Always some kind of critter in those shadows, though. I looked suspiciously towards the woods. Tom nodded. His easy grin returned, and the SUV was soon a receding plume of dust. Later that evening, Lacy stopped by to check on me and relaxed while I had a glass of tea and awaited Miriam to get home from her office. Lacy had a nice bowl of cold water. So did you see the new deputy? She shook her head and flicked her chin to let me know that she'd been far out in the wilderness earlier, then looked up with interest. Well, they brought in a canine. Sharp-looking dog. His name is Oscar. She gave me the so-what look, as if the information wasn't as interesting as I thought it would be. I was a little surprised. It didn't usually take much to excite her. Looks like Knox will be the handler. Explains why he hasn't been around lately. They had to go to school. You know, plain old dogs have to learn what to do, and human handlers have to learn how to read doggish. Not every pooch can be super intelligent and have conversations. She gave me her hideous, friendly grin and huffed out a little foul breath in my direction. Whatever else she liked hearing, she was a good girl. Well, if you weren't here this morning, then something under the trees certainly had Oscar stirred. Maybe a coyote or a fox? Lacy looked away and pretended to have an itch. She was clearly hiding something from me, but it was apparently nothing serious. Fine, keep your secrets, kiddo, I thought as I re-scratched that last patch of fur that had given her an itch. The beast that had once been Pete Barnum stalked through the night-darkened forest. Those redneck wolves had attacked him, and Drew Elbert had infected him with this hideous condition. What was left of his human mind laughed a little. I'd have expected any infections to come from Nancy, skank. Regardless, he had to deal with it, and he had to watch over his family until he could figure out a way to make it better. Then he'd met that other creature. He'd heard rumors, and old Earl had told him about her, but she was magnificent to see. Lacy. That's when they first encountered one another. It was clear she'd stalked him, and something in her smell or appearance made his hackles rise. They were natural enemies. He knew that at the most visceral level. Yet she'd taken pity on him, and since he knew that she had been Earl's treasured pet, well, it led to a truce. And for a time there was a peace between apex predators in the forest of fear. Now he stalked a different prey, not the feral hogs that were so abundant and on which he enjoyed feasting. There would be no blood at the end of this hunt. He watched over his children, in this case his daughter, their youngest at age 12. She had ridden her bicycle over to her friend's home, and now the two girls sat outside, chattering in their piping voices as they sat on the porch and shared various information on their phones. He was glad to see that his baby girl had what she needed and wanted. He planned to watch her until she made it home. So he sat in the cooling shade, and his eyes slid shut as he listened and reveled in her little voice. He awakened with a start. It was nearly sundown. The girls were gone from the porch, and no, Olivia's bike was gone. She was on her own. He had to protect her. He didn't know quite from what, but his instincts told him that her safety was his responsibility. She was his cub. He raced along the wild patches and, when necessary, wound through the human structures and conveyances on all fours to catch up with her. He caught her scent and tracked her. It grew stronger, and at last there she was. She still had her bike, but she was not riding. Just a short way from home, she stood, holding the handlebars as she spoke to a trio of older girls. These girls were too old to be her friends. Then he noted a vehicle that approached slowly down the street. It was familiar. Police. Yes, that's what it was. Then he got a scent that he did not expect. He had become a terror to the local dog population, yet this one was different. It was part of the police unit. He recognized the officer as Tom Knox. Good young man. He'd keep Olivia safe. He relaxed a little and even considered receding back into the forest. But then that dog. It began to bark insanely, clearly alerted to him. He sought the shadows, but it did no good. Most dogs feared him, but this one barked and was fierce in its own way. I would shred him in seconds and make a meal of him, but he would try. Brave and silly. He must be young. Officer Knox slowed his SUV to a stop near the four girls. He, of course, knew Olivia and had encountered the others around the area. He was sure he knew their families. "Good evening, ladies," he waved all the while. Oscar continued to bark and snarl insanely. "Ms. Olivia, I was on the way to your place. Wanted to introduce you and your brothers and your mom to our newest officer, Not sure what has him so stirred up. Oscar, quiet! It worked for a grand total of 2 seconds, and then the working dog started in again with the growls and whines that quickly turned back into barks. I'll take him on to your house. See you soon. He eyed the 3 older girls, who had each backed steadily away from the canine vehicle. They made quick goodbyes and walked back down the street. Olivia followed Officer Knox and his ferocious charge the rest of the way to their home. The shadow that had watched them faded back and disappeared into the woods. Miriam had apparently enjoyed the supper I prepared, and now the dishes were done. We spooned on the couch and watched the mindless drivel on the big screen. Not sure why I'd bought the thing. I hardly watch it. I mainly used it to watch movies. However, my grown-up girl liked it, so I hadn't thrown anything at it lately. Teresa and Jacob are coming down for the long weekend. They really took a shine to you. And of course, Jacob is infatuated with Lacy. In a healthy way, she quickly added to intercept the smart aleck comment she knew I'd make. What kid wouldn't love a friendly dog man? I grinned to myself. The quip about unhealthy love interest had crossed my mind, but I'd never intended to give voice to it. I loved her after a fashion, and I liked the kid. He was smart and energetic in a non-destructive way. So can they stay for the entire holiday? Maybe we can invite some other folks over on Saturday. Let them have a shop on Friday. I don't know many kids in the area, but maybe we could invite Pete Barnum's brood over for a get-together. They'll have a tough time with their dad missing on Thanksgiving. Might as well keep 'em busy. She gave me a tender kiss. Earl, you are a very thoughtful man. Those kids and their mother must be pretty worried. Still no sign of poor Pete? I'm sure Seraph Cloud will take care of him on Thursday, but yes. By Saturday, they will be lonely and full of heavy thoughts. Maybe we can invite Julie if she has no plans, and that nice Deputy Knox. She loved to make matches. She'd have hopes for Valerie and some poor fellow, maybe Tom, but Val was a committed city girl these days, and while we talked online, she had no plans to return to Podunk. Poor Julie still lived close, though, and she and Knox seemed to get along well. They were about the same age, and both worked weird shifts. They'd understand one another. Those poor kids. Miriam Stone was a determined woman. Tom drove back down the street from Pete Barnum's place. Oscar had recovered himself and was once again seated in the back, panting with a gape-mouthed grin and alternating between alertness and trying to catch a dog nap. Pete's kids had been enthralled with the new member of their dad's department. They were good kids, and the elder boy, PJ, wanted to follow in his father's footsteps. Pete hadn't wanted that, but he knew better than to directly oppose a teenage boy. "Well, Big O, did you like Pete's young'uns?" Oscar licked his chops and snapped his mouth shut, then went back to his happy panting. Tom grinned in turn and shook his head. "Thanks, buddy. It would mean a lot to Pete to know that we checked in on him." He had it in mind to check out where the other 3 girls had gone. If they'd stayed on track, they'd soon have juvie files. And he didn't want them trying to drag down Olivia or just hurt her because her dad was a peace officer. It was now past dark, and they should be headed home, but none of them had parents who would be there or care whether they did homework, ate, or in any way took care of themselves. Job security, he said to himself ruefully. He turned off his headlights as he approached the little park with its one swing set and a few picnic tables. He rolled down the window. Yep, the stench of tobacco smoke and wonderful ganja. He looked around into the poor-lit area, and there they were, all lined up at the picnic table. He put on his game face and alerted his partner. "All right, buddy, time to earn your kibble. Your first big small-town case." He turned off the road and onto the grass. Odd, all three of the girls were looking out into the darkness of a patch of woods, probably hallucinating or pretending to. He activated his emergency lights as the girls turned to run towards him. They screamed, and the high-pitched tones blended appallingly with the deep-throated roar of anger. A titanic black shadow thundered from the forest in pursuit. As two of the girls looked back over their shoulder, it rose to its hind legs. "Crap! Another werewolf!" his mind screamed as the three delinquents ran past his patrol car. His training took over, and he hit the automatic window button for the back area so his new partner could join him. He stepped out and drew his sidearm, and for the second time in his life, sought to kill a werewolf. This time, however, the beast in question was not wounded and understood the threat that the firearm posed. With a quick and contemptuous slash of its claws, it swiped the pistol from its grip and left a pair of long, raking wounds on the inside of his right forearm. One of the gouges immediately fountained and started pumping out the young deputy's lifeblood. That was when Oscar overrode his fear and leapt from the patrol unit. He closed quickly on the monstrous form and sunk his teeth into the werewolf's arm, even as it drew back from striking Oscar's partner, his packmate. One good wound deserved another, yet size and power mattered in a fight, and the monster clamped its own enormous jaws onto Oscar's neck, which forced the loyal dog to release his grip. The werewolf slung him about a few times and then spat him contemptuously at Knox's feet. It stepped forward and raised its hand for another strike. The smell of the two-legged Knox thing drove his insane and dreadful hunger, and the piteous whimpers of his canine attacker stirred instincts to vanquish the foe, to remove the threat from his world. Yet it paused, stood and quavered, engaged in a war between opposing instincts. It knew on some level where Barnum still lived that this was wrong. It should not consume the flesh of the two legs. Oh, but the hunger gnawed at his mind and his belly. With a pained growl of anger and confusion, the creature stepped back. Then it turned and fled into the night. Knox hadn't noticed the tableau that unfolded underneath the looming shadow the monster had cast over him. He was very busy tightening and locking down the tourniquet he'd made from his duty belt. Good thing Sheriff Cloud's a tactical thinker, he thought gratefully. He had gotten them for the entire department after the last Elbert incident, and they'd practiced using them on themselves and each other. Oscar whined a little in obvious pain. His own wounds leaked blood and his eyes remained closed tight. "I got this, buddy," Knox said tightly, then used his radio to contact dispatch and get some help on the way. Maybe Julie will show. I kind of like her. His thoughts trailed off as he fought to maintain consciousness. The beast that had been Deputy Barnum ran swiftly through the small patches of trees towards the more extensive woods at the edge of town. He'd only meant to frighten those little turds, but when they screamed and ran, his new nature rose to the forefront, and he gave chase. All pretense of any motive but hunger gone as the monster subsumed the man. Now he was frightened by what he'd done, afraid of how he would act around his family. He couldn't hurt them. He couldn't risk what would happen if one of them did something to trigger his baser instincts. Jean Cloud sat and brooded in worry about his deputy and friend. He'd suspected for a while what had happened to Pete. Barnum had been on duty the night Lacy Elbert slaughtered, and at least partially devoured her parents. She'd been full, having recently devoured her boyfriend, Phil Lefevre, as though he were a large order of French fries. Barnum had possessed the presence of mind to call him directly, so that only those two and JP had any idea of what the scene looked like. They'd put together a team to clean the scene, and while they processed it legally, he'd done everything he could to keep the details of how far it had gone from becoming public knowledge. Lacy Elbert was a piece of work, but nowhere near the low-life trash that her cousins had been. The sheriff's department had handled those two on several occasions, and they'd fought every single time, especially Nancy. He couldn't picture Lacy eating her boyfriend and parents alone. Maybe she'd had help from her scuzzy cousins. It had to be the nature of the beasts. He'd studied wares since then and believed that something in their nature subsumed whatever remained of their humanity when it came to feeding time. Phil had been good to and for Lacy Elbert, yet she shredded him and devoured the meat from his corpse first. It was said in some circles that werewolves always ended up hurting those they had loved the most. Part of a curse or something? He didn't buy that, but he believed strongly in the psychological harm that would come from the trauma of such a dramatic shift in the physical and instinctive nature of a person. Now his friend Pete Barnum had gone through a similar transformation into, he wasn't sure what. His radio squawked and startled him from his reverie. He was soon on the way to the scene in fear for another of his deputies, Tom Knox. The monster situation was growing out of his control. I drove up to the office with Dr. Stone. The emergency call was about Oscar, the new canine officer. He had been mauled by an animal and was in pretty bad shape. The deputy who brought him into the emergency clinic sounded pretty shaken. Miriam had the call on speaker, and we could both tell that she was unsure how to react. Deb will be there in a few minutes. Nobody to stop us from speeding, but if there's a ticket, give it to Earl. He's driving. I smiled tightly and briefly. Miriam was pretty steady under stress. After all, she'd thrown a grenade at a werewolf. She was stressed herself, but used humor to break the tension for both she and Deputy Rocharon. She was all but out the door before I came to a complete stop and dashed to the clinic doors, keys at the ready. I would have offered to help the deputy carry the poor canine into the clinic, but she had a good handle on him. She was a stout woman, a part-timer. I had a momentary flashback at the sight of the blood-stained and very limp dog in the arms of a blood-smeared, frightened, concerned human. It was so similar to what happened with Lacy. But Oscar's head dangled and his tongue lolled, and his eyes were slitted and glassy with pain and shock. He was more seriously injured than my girl had been. I held the door for the deputies after they and Miriam were all in the examination room. I started a pot of coffee. Dr. Stone had no need to order her orderly to do that anymore. As I puttered about the front of the office, I heard Deputy Rocharon use her radio to contact Jean. "Yes, sir. He's at the clinic. Doc's working on stabilizing him. Any word on Knox?" Jean's voice came through with just a little electronic fuzz. "He's on his way to the ER. Paramedic says it looked like the tourniquet worked. Big concern now is shock." There was a slight pause. "I'm still on scene. If you're clear, head my way, and bring Earl and his shotgun." Lacy noted that scent, oddly familiar from one of her earliest memories. She'd watched as the Elbert twins left her behind at the store, alone, abandoned, frightened, and in pain, yet relieved that the two monsters were getting farther away from her with every step. Better alone than with them. She still eyed them warily, afraid they'd turn back towards her. Then an immense creature stepped from just inside the woodline. It moved almost silently and exuded a tremendous odor. The two-legged bitch that turned towards the foul smell just in time to get bitten on the shoulder. The two-legged male turned and saw the danger, too late to do more than just raise his thick arm to protect himself. The old one had bitten him before he could even manage a scream of fear. He shook and tugged at the arm a little, and as both of the evil humans fell to the ground in fear and pain, he'd let go and turned towards Lacy. She beat a little and shrank back in terror, but the large, old dog-man simply favored her with an evil grin, and then leapt back into the shadows of the trees. He'd been in the area on his migration track and had observed how the Elberts had treated the poor puppy. A creature much like he'd once been, though both of his parents had already been dogmen when he was born. Some were born, some were turned, but these human creatures would now become the enemy. The monsters that he reveled in chasing, fighting and killing. Maybe the pup would get them before he returned to these woods. She and her pack had indeed gotten them before he'd returned, and this time she knew of his presence before he knew of hers. She knew his nature and no longer feared him much. He was still much larger than she, and there was something wild about him that she lacked. She let out a low bark and a huff towards his location, and directly she was rewarded by the sight of her old rescuer as he peered through a spray of dead leaves in the autumn forest. When he realized she'd spotted him, he burst through the remaining screen of vegetation and rose up to his full height in challenge and greeting. Jean greeted Deputy Rocherin and me when we arrived at the park. We all carried lights and long guns. It took us a while to get Deb on board with the fact that we were about to embark on a monster hunt. It just wasn't her purview. Sheriff Cloud hadn't wanted word to spread, but he was getting short on deputies who already knew. He'd have to trust her. He already did to a large degree. He wouldn't have hired her and kept her on for most of the past decade if he hadn't. But this was the kind of information that got licenses pulled for mental instability. "Look," he said, "I don't really want to wade into those trees after dark. But it's been an hour or so since the attack. Good chance he's moved out of the area, but there's too many homes around the park to make assumptions. He left a pretty clear trail. We'll follow it until we either catch up to him or ensure that he's left the area. Earl, this has to be strictly voluntary on your part. Are you okay with it?" "Yes, but Miriam, Dr. Stone says that if you get me hurt or killed, you'll have to settle with her." I grinned humorlessly. He nodded, and we got underway on the hideously dangerous nighttime stalk. Pete Barnum, Beast, rushed deep into the woods, at first heedlessly of direction, shifting this way and that on the path of least resistance. The hunger raged within him. It gnawed his innards and his mind and tattered his sensibilities. He barreled ahead once more, burning away as much of the feeling as he could manage with the effort, when he barged into a sounder of feral hogs. He was among them before either him or they realized. An enormous boar, alert and on guard, charged him, and the two collided in a brief but savage battle. The porcine male tore at him with its tusks as it sped past him. He'd gracefully sidestepped and raked his claws along its back. It spun and gaped and attempted to bite him, but he wrapped its ugly head in his arms and lifted it to his fang-filled maw. The satisfying crunch and subsequent flow of gore into his mouth and gullet thrilled him. His fellow monster squealed and grunted and thrashed to no avail. He shifted his grip and raised the 400 pounds of pork above his head, then dashed it against a tree, spine first. He heard the satisfying crack, and squeals subsided to pained whines and snorts. He threw back his head and howled in triumph and challenge. He was going to feed after all, and his family was safe from his potential depredation. After a quick look around and a few sniffs of the prevailing breeze, he set to work on the feast before him. There was plenty to fill the void within him, to rend, gulp, and gobble to his heart's content. Lacy and the old one stalked the trail of the enemy. She tried to convince him that this one was different, safe. Unfortunately, their language was very direct, not complex, and held few nuances. The old one had scoffed and tried to make her understand that it was not a matter of whom the creature had been, but what it was now. In any case, they would find him and decide from there what to do. They shifted their pathway as much as possible to stay downwind from where the trail led. No guarantees, but it was at least a basic tactic. As they ranged forward, an intense and very loud howl emanated from the trail ahead. The sound was very near and accompanied by the smell of blood. A tremendous rustle of the underbrush and dried leaves drew close, and the sounder of feral hogs rushed past in genuine panic. The dogman stepped aside and let the panicked animals proceed into the forest. Lacy, as much as her nature allowed, was relieved. She knew that the monster had not yet taken a human life. That would have led to more problems for her and the old one, and any creature of a similar build. They separated and approached the feasting monstrosity as quietly as possible. Its back was to them in the light of the waning but still gibbous and bright moon. It slobbered and munched in evident ecstasy of blood-craving satisfied. She paused, intent on letting it finish its repast before she approached. It would be calm, even low-key, after such a large meal, perhaps willing to listen to threats since it was outnumbered. With a roar, the old one burst from hiding and sprang upon the back of the werewolf, even as it raised its chin to gulp down yet another goblet of bloody flesh. The two tumbled and rolled in the now small clearing. The brush and smaller trees had been trampled somewhat by the feeding sounder, and then by the strife between hunter and prey. Now it was home to a death match between two enormous brutes that roared and bit and clawed at one another as they rolled around the forest floor. Their speed made their movements a blur as each struggled to gain a killing hold on the other. Lacy wanted desperately to help, but there was no room for her. The old one hadn't waited long enough to give her a chance to run in and be a distraction, and perhaps cause some damage while he prepared a sneak attack as pack dogs would do. A very doggish plan, but apparently not the way true-born dogmen did things. She hovered, prepared to strike, should an opportunity present itself. It did not, but there was no need. The old one managed to get a fang into one of Pete's jugular, since it had been up and exposed as he swallowed his prey. A screech yowled in mortal pain and fear. Every living thing fears death, even monsters. His hunger sated and the battle lost, he faded into warm thoughts of his family. He'd protected them. Those girls would be too terrified to leave their homes, much less bother his Olivia. But mostly he protected them from himself. from what he'd become. Sheriff Cloud came to an immediate halt as his eyes caught the red shine and twin glow ahead. He raised his rifle but paused. I was there beside him, equally paused. We studied the creature for a brief instant and realized it was not a werewolf, but a dogman. Then the sharp reports of Deputy Rose Sharon's rifle barked out, and flames burst from her barrel as she unloaded on what she saw as a monster ahead of her. She'd already changed her magazine before Jean could get her to stop and focus again. Meantime, I ran ahead towards the fallen form of Lacy. Too big. Then what? About that time, I was engulfed in a hot, furry embrace and brushed aside to avoid any further danger from the deputy. I thumped soundly on the ground, and the air was driven from my lungs. I gulped in to replace it. I caught the foul, oh so welcome, disgusting breath of my girl. It didn't take long to confirm that the enormous beasts, had been Pete Barnum. The additional skin and fur sloughed from his pitiful remains, even as we watched in shock and sadness. The other creature simply melted along with him, but no dog emerged. It remained what it was, a mystery being. Lucy knew, but wouldn't be able to tell us. Some things would have to remain a mystery to we mere humans. It was a while before we had any celebrations. Pete's family was devastated. Knox recovered and became quite vigorous. He and Julie perched once more on my front porch, this time with their sides melding together, and she traced the apparent fascinating and wounded scars on his forearm. Miriam's mission had been accomplished without her interference, though she somehow managed to take credit. Couldn't possibly be that the man had stood his ground with yet another werewolf and that Julie had been largely responsible for saving his life. Never a stress bond. Had to be because of something that Miriam Stone said or did, or at least wished. This party was a send-off for Pete Jr., PJ. He was headed off for military service to get college money. There was no stopping him. He was bound and determined to be just like his father, a very worthy and honorable goal. Debbie was there with her husband, Glenn. She'd decided it was time to hang up the belt and badge, and now worked as an EMT on Julie's crew. Jacob and the twin Dogman pups played a game of tireless tag by way of the old doggy door through which Lacy would never fit again. She eyed her pups and the two-legged youngster with the wary caution of a new mother. Teresa watched her own child, young man, closely as well. Everyone was getting along, but any misunderstandings or falsely triggered instincts could result in unfortunate events. Oscar, who now towered above me as he stood and listened to the conversation between Jean and I, glanced at their pups and then at Lacy. They caught one another's eye, and Lacy grinned first. It would be fine. Kids would be kids, and we're all family after all. Author's note. Oscar was a real Belgian Malinois. His handler and I were friends, and he was friends with my Rottweiler, Pasha. When Oscar first arrived at our post in Germany, he was an unknown quantity. No one had ever worked with him, so naturally, I volunteered to be the first to catch him during aggression training. There is an opening in the bite sleeve, so that the decoy can bend his or her arm. Oscar did something unusual, though. Most dogs would come in low, and the decoy would crouch and lean into their bites. Oscar leapt. I raised my arm and instinctively pulled back my face. That thing was bad enough without any dog bites. With my arm straight, the opening left of the inside of my elbow uncovered. He hooked a tooth into that opening. He pulled the brachial artery offline, but didn't tear it. Still, I had a nice big hole in my arm. Fortunately, we were near Landstuhl Army Hospital. When I healed, the scar looked like the space shuttle in profile, at least to me. A few months later, we had the Challenger disaster, so it meant something at the time. I caught Oscar one more time. Had to prove to the kennel master that I hadn't lost it. It's tradition. After that, I ended up as his secondary handler for a couple of weeks while Kenny had to go home for a family emergency. Oscar and Pasha and a German shepherd named Elkin became our demonstration team. They and we worked as a pack. We traveled around and presented information about the dogs and handling, etc. Oscar's famous snake trick created a stir. Kenny would yell, "Snake!" and Oscar would jump into my arms. Not sure the army would approve, but that was so long ago. Any failures in description are mine, but I do speak fluent dogginese and doggish. So, quote, this raven. And with that, Bear has tied up all the loose ends into a beautiful tapestry. Thank you, Bear, for sharing this with us. And thank you all for coming to listen to me in my chateau. It does mean so much. Special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, and of course, Charlotte Emerson and Cortez Williams.